Margaret Bates had been dreading that knock for months. It was the 16th of April 1996, and as she opened her front door in Hattersley, Greater Manchester, she was met by two solemn-faced police officers. She didn't need them to speak. "I know," she whispered. She had always known. Her daughter, Kellyanne, had vanished into the grip of a man that Margaret instinctively feared from the very moment that she laid eyes on him. The kind of fear that curls into the bones. The kind that makes you want to act, but can freeze you to the spot. And now, standing in her hallway, the unbearable truth had arrived. Kellyanne wasn't coming home, and her final days were frankly, genuinely, one of the worst things I have ever researched. By the way, this is Dark Case, and you can call me Jack. I bring you rare and unseen true crime cases, as well as other things that you may later regret knowing, with multiple uploads every single week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, then join the Dark Case family now by hitting subscribe and turning all notifications on. And now for today's silly little question: what's the one movie that you love that everybody else seems to absolutely hate? Let me know down in the comments. All of your support over on Patreon and via channel memberships here on YouTube are so appreciated, and I really can't thank you all enough. However, you know I'm still going to say it, so thank you. But now, on with the video. James Patterson Smith was a man who never really stood out in a crowd. He was quiet, neatly dressed, a non-smoker, a teetotaler. The kind of man that neighbours would call ordinary. The kind that hides the worst of themselves behind polite conversation and trimmed hedges. But behind closed doors, James Smith was, frankly, a monster. His first marriage began in 1970, and it ended 10 years later. It wasn't because of infidelity. It wasn't because the two of them just grew apart. But instead because his wife simply couldn't take the beatings anymore. She'd married a man who quickly became controlling, jealous, and violent. He was a man who wouldn't stop until his wife was cowering or unconscious. And after that divorce, he didn't change. If anything, he got even worse. In 1980, he began dating Tina Watson, a 20-year-old woman who would later describe herself as his punching bag. And for 2 years, she endured relentless physical attacks. He would strike her in the face. He would smash ashtrays over her head. He'd kick her between the legs. And he struck her even while she was pregnant with his child. And then he tried to drown her. She was in the bathtub when he held her head under the water. However, she survived, but barely. And thankfully, she did escape. By 1982, Smith had moved on to his next target, a 15-year-old named Wendy Mottershead. This time, he didn't even pretend to wait for consent. He groomed Wendy, he controlled her, he hurt her. During one of many attacks, he forced her head under the kitchen sink in an attempt to drown her. She thankfully escaped from that attack. However, his behaviour continued, always escalating. The pattern was clear. James Patterson Smith was a man who didn't just like to dominate women, he tried to destroy them in every single way. But because none of his former victims had ever pressed formal charges, his record stayed clean. And to the outside world, he was now just a reclusive older man, living alone in Gorton, Manchester. To the women that he dated, he was a nightmare in human form. And in 1993, he found his next victim, and she was just 14 years old. Her name was Kellyanne Bates. Before the darkness of this story, Kellyanne Bates was a burst of energy and kindness. Born on May 18, 1978, she grew up in the working-class town of Hattersley. This is just outside Greater Manchester. Her parents, Margaret and Tommy, doted on her. They weren't monetarily rich, but the family was close-knit. Kellyanne had 2 younger brothers, and they absolutely adored her. At school, she was athletic, outgoing, and fiercely independent. She loved swimming, loved laughing, and her teachers described her as sharp, driven, and compassionate. She herself had dreams of becoming a teacher, something that she told anyone who would listen. By the time she turned 14, Kellyanne had already started carving out a future for herself. She was attending college part-time to improve her GCSEs. She had a part-time job at a graphics firm to help pay her way. She was confident, clever, and always on the move. She was also very caring, perhaps to a fault. If someone needed help, Kellyanne was the first to volunteer. She believed in second chances, in the goodness of people, and it was exactly that warmth, her belief that even the most difficult people could be understood, that made her an easy target. Because when she met James Smith in 1993, she didn't see a dangerous man. She saw someone older, mysterious, someone who seemed interested in her thoughts, not just her appearance. They met while she was babysitting for a family friend, and Smith, then 45, offered to walk her home. Kellyanne, just 14 at the time, may have felt flattered, seen and protected. She had no idea that she was being hunted. Smith didn't rush things in this case. He didn't need to. He had time and he had patience. And he had the experience in exactly this kind of grooming. He slowly inserted himself into her life under the radar. He called it a relationship, but we know that it wasn't that. It was control right from the start. Still, from the outside, everything looked normal. Her parents had no idea that she was seeing anyone, let alone a man 3 decades older. And Kellyanne didn't give them a reason to suspect otherwise. She was still going to college, she was still working, and she was still smiling, at least in public. But slowly, subtle changes crept in. She became a little more withdrawn, a little more private, a little harder to reach. And when her parents finally learned that she did have a boyfriend, she simply gave them a name, Dave, a harmless and ordinary name for a man who was anything but. For 2 years, Kellyanne kept the truth hidden. She told her parents that Dave was just a schoolmate. So they assumed that he was someone her own age, a classmate, maybe a boy from college, and they didn't push the fact. Kellyanne had never given them a reason to doubt her. But then she started disappearing, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, and she'd start coming home with bruises on her arms or face. Once her face was blackened and swollen, and she claimed that a group of girls at school had jumped her. Another time she had deep bite marks. She called that an accident. Margaret and Tommy were concerned, but Kellyanne kept on insisting that everything was fine. So when Dave finally called the house to speak with Margaret directly, it almost felt like a relief. He was polite, he was well-spoken, and he was attentive. He said that he loved Kellyanne. He said that he was good to her. However, when Margaret and Tommy finally met the man in person, their blood ran cold. Smith came down the stairs of their home with a smug smile, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Margaret took one look at him, and she felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't a teenager, he wasn't even just in his 20s. He was a grown man, pushing 50. Margaret's instinct was immediate and violent. She later said that when she saw the bread knife in the kitchen, she had to fight the urge to pick it up, and then lunge at him in the back with it. And this wasn't because she was cruel, but because something in her knew. She knew that this man was dangerous. She knew that he would hurt her daughter. She knew something was wrong, but Kellyanne now wouldn't listen. She believed she was in love. Like so many victims of grooming, she didn't realize what was happening to her. To her, Smith was just older, protective and passionate. She didn't see the red flags for what they were. She saw them as signs of love in one way or another, of concern, of possession disguised as care. So when her parents begged her to break things off, she refused. Instead, she dug in deeper, no doubt under the coaching of Smith. On November the 30th, 1995, Kellyanne left home and moved in with Smith. This was at his house on Furnival Road in Gorton. She was now 17, so all of this was legal. There was nothing that anyone could do. From the outside, Kellyanne Bates had simply moved in with her boyfriend. But inside the house on Furnival Road, a nightmare was unfolding. Within just weeks of living together, Kellyanne's already limited contact with her friends and family now dropped off entirely. There were no visits and no phone calls unless Smith was present. Her parents now couldn't reach her. Her younger brothers never saw her again. And her part-time job at the graphics firm, she was forced to quit that in December. When March rolled around, her parents received 2 handwritten cards, one for Tommy's birthday, the other for their anniversary. Both of them were supposedly from Kellyanne, but neither was in her handwriting. Margaret now knew that something was very wrong. She begged Kelly's father Tommy to go to the house to demand to see their daughter, but he hesitated. They worried that confronting Smith might push Kellyanne even further into isolation. Then came the brief, strange moments. Times when someone asked about Kellyanne, and she'd been seen at a window but only for a second, standing silently and expressionless. She'd become a ghost in her own life. The neighbours didn't see her come and go, so it seemed she was kept indoors. The house was quiet, but then it grew totally silent. There were no calls, no visits, nothing. Until that is, April the 16th, 1996. On that morning, James Patterson Smith walked into Gorton Police Station. He calmly stated that his girlfriend was no longer breathing. He claimed it was a result of an accident. They'd been arguing in the bath, he said. She'd slipped underwater. He said he tried to revive her, but it was too late. Officers were dispatched to the house, and what they found would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Kellyanne wasn't found in the bathroom. Instead, she was found without clothing in her bedroom. There was red spatter and smears in every room of the house, on walls, ceilings and furniture. Her hair was tied around furniture and radiators. In other places, strands were used as ligatures. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. This wasn't even a single act of rage. This was long-term, methodical, calculated torture, and it looked like it had been going on for weeks. The full horror of what Kellyanne had endured would only be revealed through the post-mortem. It took hours to document the damage. There were over 150 separate injuries. Many of them were inflicted over the span of a month. She had been starved. Experts estimated she had lost around 20 kilograms in those final weeks. She was also severely dehydrated. She had been restrained, often tied by her own hair, or with makeshift ligatures around her neck. Her arms, legs and hands bore signs of repeated blunt trauma. Her kneecaps had been shattered. She had sharp impact markings to her mouth, inside her cheeks and lips. She'd been burned on her legs and behind, scalded with boiling water, and branded with a hot iron. Private areas had been what was described as mutilated. Her scalp was partially removed, and what seems almost unbelievable, her eyes had been gouged out. Perhaps the most harrowing detail came from the Home Office pathologist, Dr. William Lawler. He determined that Kellyanne had been blinded for at least 5 days, and possibly up to 3 weeks, before her time on this earth came to an end. I want to be real with you guys for a minute. I've seen a lot of things and read a lot of things. Over 300 cases now, which is pretty crazy, but something about that just really got me. I'm going to make a coffee, take 5, and then you won't know any of this ever happened. After the act of the gouging, Smith had continued to jab her in her empty sockets. Lawler, who had examined over 600 homicide victims in his career, said that it was the worst case he'd ever seen. Turns out I need to take 5 more minutes as well. Kellyanne was struck around the head with her shower head before being drowned in the bathtub. That was the final act that ended her time on this earth. But everything leading up to it had already taken everything from her. Peter Openshaw, the prosecuting attorney, later told the court it was as if he deliberately disfigured her, causing her the utmost pain, distress and degradation. These injuries were not the result of one sudden eruption of violence. They must have been caused over a long period, and were so extensive and so terrible that the defendant must have done this deliberately and systematically. There was no question now, this was not manslaughter. This was not an argument gone wrong. This was evil and sustained. This was intentional, and it was absolute. James Patterson Smith stood trial in November 1997 at Manchester Crown Court. He pleaded not guilty to murder. His defense was frankly, totally pathetic. That Kellyanne had taunted him, that she had mocked his dead mother, that she challenged him to hurt her. At one point, he even claimed that she had a bad habit of hurting herself to make him look bad. The jury wasn't buying it. They heard from a consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Gillian Meze, who testified that Smith suffered from severe paranoid disorder and morbid jealousy. He lived, she said, in a distorted reality. But even that could not explain the magnitude of the cruelty. The prosecution laid out his history, the ex-wife who left him after years of beatings, the 2 young women who he had previously maltreated and then attempted to drown. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of a man who thrived on domination. The photos of Kellyanne's injuries were so graphic and so distressing that every member of the jury was offered professional counselling after the trial, and every one of them accepted. It took the jury just 1 hour to return a verdict. They found him guilty. The judge, Mr. Justice Sachs, sentenced Smith to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. He told him, "You are a highly dangerous person. You are an abuser of women, and I intend, so far as it is in my power, that you will abuse no more." And for decades, Smith stayed behind bars. But in late 2023, 25 years after sentencing, James Patterson Smith became eligible for parole. He appeared before a 3-person parole board, and he claimed to be a changed man. He asked not just for release, but to be transferred to an open prison. The answer was swift, and thank goodness it was denied. The board concluded that Smith was still too dangerous to be moved to a lower security facility. He will remain in closed conditions for the foreseeable future, but under current UK law, he is now eligible for regular parole reviews. That means Kellyanne's name will surface again, and we should all be reminded of what happened and who did it, and of how easily monsters like Smith can wear masks of normalcy. In my eyes, for as long as he is still alive, he's still waiting for a chance to do this again. Kelly's mother, Margaret, however, is no longer with us. She passed in 2020, having spent her final years with a single gnawing regret, that she hadn't trusted the instinct that told her to pick up that bread knife. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.